This is a very mysterious story that I heard from my mother about my grandfather. My grandfather returned to his hometown in the 1960s and was assigned to work as a teacher in a rural primary school. He loved his job very much and also loved the children. It was said that my grandfather was the funniest and most loving teacher in the school, so some students, even from far away, came here to study with him. My grandfather was very enthusiastic. He always hoped that he would be able to change the lives of poor children in the countryside with his knowledge. At that time, there was a child who didn't go to school for 2 days. My grandfather didn't know what was happening, but he was really worried about the child. He asked the child from the same village as the girl, and the student said that she was helping in the fields at home. My grandfather shared a house with a villager. That night when my grandfather sat down to eat, he asked Uncle Kang about the little girl. Uncle Kang roughly said to my grandfather,
"Her father died long ago. The little girl was the only child in the family, so she had to take care of herself since she was small."
My grandfather said that the child did very well in school. She walked more than 10 miles to school every day. He wanted to go to her house to see if he could help. Uncle Kang wanted to dissuade my father from going, but he knew that he couldn't stop my grandpa.
"Okay, go ahead, but be careful. The road is dangerous."
My grandfather prepared everything and set off on the road. Because the mountain road was very dangerous and craggy, the air was cold, so the surrounding became even scarier. When my grandfather left the house, it was already dark. All the houses around were closed and silent, and there was only the sound of frogs. My grandfather went to the girl's house and helped her family with some chores and taught her lessons from the days when she didn't go to school. It was completely dark outside then. Everything was in the dark. It was already past 9 o'clock in the evening, and my father had also started to finish work for the day. That little girl and her mother thanked my grandfather because he really helped them a lot too.
"You should arrange work and go to school,"
my grandfather said to the girl and left. When my grandfather walked for a little bit, the girl's mother reminded him not to take the path through the woods, but my grandfather didn't pay much attention to her words. He walked home. The bright moonlight in the sky illuminated the way for him. Walking the forest at night, like this, was very creepy. My grandfather also felt insecure because the mountains and forests were wild. If he was not careful, he could lose his way home at any time. So he started looking at his watch. The watch on his hand showed it was 9:30. If he went on the main road of the village, he would not have time to prepare his lessons for tomorrow when he came home. To save some time to go home earlier, my grandfather chose to take a shortcut into the forest. This shortcut was a direct way home, so it would take less time, of course. No one could know how old the forest was. At night, it was easy to see certain blue flames like flickering ghosts. But my grandpa was not afraid at all. He knew that these blue flames were formed by evaporation of phosphorus from the corpses of people or animals. Not only was he not afraid, but he also found this to be beautiful, because thanks to the blue light, the way home was clearer without fear of getting lost. People in the village rarely dared to walk in the forest, below the sound of my grandfather's footsteps stepping on branches and leaves. My grandfather walked and made a rustling sound when he walked. Although he was not afraid, he was also very cautious because this forest had quite a lot of poisonous snakes. Because there was not only a rustling sound at my father's feet but also the sound behind him, he started to feel quite scared. At first, my grandfather just thought that someone was going into the forest looking for something, or an animal was running around and stepping on leaves, so that would make the noise. But when he looked around at the source of the sound, it was clear that he couldn't see anything. Everything fell into silence again. My grandfather said that at that moment he felt a chill in his back. It was a feeling he had never experienced before. It made him shiver. My grandfather started to speed up. He tried to walk faster to get home, but the rustle behind him got louder and louder. Grandpa turned around suddenly because he sensed danger, not simply a noise made by some animal. This thing was much worse. But as soon as my grandfather turned around, he still couldn't see what or who was watching him. The noises were almost gone silent. Grandpa said that he had never been so scared. He knew for sure something was following him. While he was afraid, he also thought of a way to see what was happening. My grandfather carried a small mirror in his briefcase, and he started taking it out. It seemed to be an ordinary mirror, but its use was not to show people. My grandpa used reflections from light to see behind him. Maybe this was a bit silly, but this mirror would help my grandfather know what was following him. This time, Grandpa saw something inside the mirror. His eyes showed panic. His face started to sweat a little. In the mirror, my grandfather saw a very clear image of a child. That child looked blurry and unidentified, standing right behind him. The kid looked monstrous. The hair covered his face to the extent that my grandfather couldn't tell if it was a boy or a girl, but the kid was definitely not that old. Then my grandfather stood still for a few seconds. Right now he seemed to realize something about this child. He must not be an ordinary child at all. My grandfather tried to keep himself as calm as possible, but even he didn't know what to do with himself. Should he run or stay still? And then my grandfather made a decision for himself. He couldn't just stand there waiting for someone to save him. He started running. And as he ran, he felt danger close behind him. He couldn't see it, but he recognized the child with the hair covering the face chasing after him. Grandpa was so afraid that the child would catch up with him and harm him, so he continued to use the mirror to look and see if the child was still behind him. He already knew what this child was, and only by looking in the mirror could one see it. This time, my grandfather saw something more terrifying. The scene before his eyes made him shiver. That was still the same kid, but he looked terrible. The child's hair was blown up by the wind and half of his face was exposed. The other side of his face was completely rotted, looking disgusting. He was extremely scary, and my grandfather was scared, but his mind suddenly became clearer, and then he remembered hitting the gong he was carrying. My grandfather didn't know if the gong would cover his running footsteps or if the echo from the gong would scare the child away. But just like that, my grandfather beat the gong and ran so fast that he didn't dare to stop. In the end, he ran out of the forest anyway. He did not reduce his running speed and continued all the way to Uncle Kang's house, which still had a light on. My grandpa was completely exhausted by the time he got home. He could barely breathe. It took a long time for him to regain his strength. Uncle Kang also knew what happened to my grandfather, and he also knew who the child was that my grandfather met in the forest. It was a child who died tragically in the village a few years ago. When the child was 8 years old, he had carelessly played with the horse's tail, and that's when the tragedy happened. As a result, the horse ruffled its hair in panic because its tail was touched. So it kicked the child's face with its hooves and knocked the kid away. The little girl fell from the air and hit the ground with blood splashing, and half of her face was disfigured, looking very terrible. She died on the spot. Because she was so young, she died instantly. She couldn't enter her ancestors' graves, so she was buried in the forest. Uncle Kang said the child probably just wanted to play with him. She did not want to harm him. My grandfather understood everything. He felt that this child was also pitiful, and just because of a little mistake that she had to receive such a tragic death is very sad. After that, every time my grandfather passed through the forest, he no longer felt fear, because he knew that in this forest there was a very poor soul. My grandfather used to visit the child's small grave and then place pure white flowers on top. And that child never followed my grandfather ever again. There's another creepy story about my grandfather. It happened when he was a teacher in the village. For his convenience, my grandfather rented a place near the school. When he moved in, my grandfather asked a close friend to help him move things, and he also met the owner of the house to hand over before leaving. "Sorry to bother you, this house is very comfortable, but I need to move closer to the school for easy transportation." My grandfather felt sorry. "I understand, it's okay, but the place you moved to, I heard it's not so clean, it used to be cow stables," said Mr. Wong. That was not a problem for my grandfather. The important thing was that it was cheap and close to school. However, at that moment, Mr. Wong's face hardened. He said that the unclean thing he was talking about there was that the house was rumored to be haunted. When my grandfather heard that, he laughed. He didn't care about ghosts because my grandfather also encountered many ghosts before. My grandfather was also curious to ask the landlord what had happened there. So Mr. Wong immediately mentioned a villager named Lu who was 20 years old but suffered from mental illness and urinary problems. When Lu was only 15 years old and still a normal student, he had a problem with urinating, and he asked permission to go to the toilet. The teacher was a little angry because he was focusing on lecturing but was interrupted by Lu. He shouted to tell Lu to go quickly and return immediately. He didn't forget to grumble and thought that Lu could only use excuses to ask to go out without studying seriously. Because the way to the toilet was a bit far, when passing an old warehouse, Lu had a fleeting idea. So he went inside the warehouse to deal with this problem. Lu was comfortable peeing because he thought no one would come in. While he was urinating, from behind Lu, a scary woman appeared. The coldness emanating from her made him startled. Lu was so scared he fell right into his puddle of urine. He was so scared he couldn't even lift his legs. So he tried to crawl out and call for help. Hearing about this, my grandfather curiously asked the landlord what Lu said. Mr. Wong said, "It was a woman with a terrifying long tongue." The story didn't bother my grandfather, so he said goodbye to the old owner and left. Mr. Wong said goodbye and said that if my grandfather had any problems in the house, he would like to rent out Mr. Wong's old place again in the future to just contact him. Back at the new rented house, my grandfather brought some personal belongings into the house and started cleaning. The house was really old. My grandfather started to carry the table to the corner of the wall. However, something appeared in front of my grandfather's eyes that surprised him. Close to the wall there was a portrait of a woman. My grandfather was curious. He didn't understand why the old owner, when moving out of this place, left this picture frame here. Grandpa held the picture frame for a while. The woman's face showed something very sad. However, because he found it unnecessary, my grandfather immediately put the picture frame in the trash. That night, after finishing cleaning, my grandfather went to bed because he still had to go to school early in the morning. He began to draw the curtains on the windows so that the wind would not blow in. This house was not too bad for a poor teacher like him. Going to bed, he quickly blew out the kerosene lamp. After that, he also quickly fell asleep. After a while, suddenly a strange noise came out, a sound as if from afar. "Get out of my house! Get out! Get out quickly!" Because the voice grew louder, it woke my grandfather. Because of severe nearsightedness, his sight was a bit blurry. Someone was standing at the head of the bed and wanted to chase him out. She approached and shouted in a terrifying voice. Immediately afterward, she rushed toward my grandfather. Everything happened so fast that my grandfather was shocked. He saw that the scary woman with veins floating all over her face, her eyes were white, rushing towards my grandfather at lightning speed and screaming for my grandfather to get out of there. Suddenly the sunlight woke my grandfather up. Strangely, he found himself lying in the yard. He didn't understand what the hell was going on. Opening the door of the house and looking inside in his sleep, he did not understand why he was lying outside. My grandfather came over and picked up his glasses. As soon as he finished putting on his glasses, a strange thing made him startle. Right on the table was a picture frame from yesterday. He threw it out in the trash. But more frightening, my grandfather seemed to remember that terrible nightmare. Yes, it was her, the ghostly woman who screamed to chase him out of the house. He immediately went to ask Mr. Wong about the scary thing. Maybe he would know something more about her. Mr. Wong mused sadly and recounted the story of that woman. It's her, poor woman. That old woman's name was Zhang. When the war broke out because her son was suspected of joining the enemy, she was imprisoned and she was also arrested. However, she always believed her son was wronged. Because of her bad reputation, she could not leave the house. Then, in the most painful moment, she hanged herself. So since then, her spirit had always stayed in his house to wait for her son to return. Mr. Wang thought he had a way to comfort Ms. Zhang. He also said that his son had been exonerated but had died in prison before. That year, the government sent to the locality a medal to register the noble feat of his son. Since the family had no one left, Mr. Wang kept it. My grandfather then put the badge in front of Ms. Zhang's picture frame, hoping that her spirit would meet her son, as well as letting her understand that his son was exonerated a long time ago. Well, after that, my grandfather also fervently begged to stay in this house to teach while working in the village. He also promised to sincerely pray for her and her son. He hoped she would leave with peace of mind. That night, the space became strangely quiet, and my grandfather had a truly good night's sleep. Nothing scary happened anymore. Perhaps the woman's soul was at peace. She did not trouble my grandfather anymore. With demonic things, my grandfather always said that as long as he didn't do anything wrong, there was nothing to be afraid of. This is a creepy story from my grandpa that he told about his time teaching in this village. After working for a while, because of his handsome and gentle appearance, my grandpa was loved by the villagers here. That day, my grandpa was walking down the street when he saw a group of children fighting. When he got closer, he saw two children bullying another beggar. They seemed very gloating. "Stop immediately!" My grandpa walked over and asked them to stop immediately. He recognized the other two children as upperclassmen. He asked them why they were bullying this poor boy. The students immediately said that the boy was an eccentric and painless idiot. Looking closely at this child, there were many old wounds on his face, and my grandpa also realized that this boy was mentally challenged. Immediately the boy ran away and ignored my grandpa reaching out to call back. Then he asked why they were bullying the boy, because as far as my grandpa knew, the two students were all good students in the school. Then one of them said that they hit the boy for revenge, and said that the mentally disabled boy had caused the trouble first. Hearing that, my grandpa asked them to tell him everything. They said there was an abandoned house on the edge of the village. It was their secret base and they used to go there quite often. That day when the group of children was playing inside the house, suddenly the mentally challenged boy ran up and asked them all to get out of there. Even the next day, the mentally disturbed boy showed a harsh attitude. He held up rocks to threaten people. The children at the time were very confused and did not understand what was happening. They only knew how to avoid that dangerous rocks. The mentally challenged boy became madder and madder. He kept picking rocks and harshly chasing these kids out of there as if that house was his home. But when the children ran away for a while, they suddenly heard a loud bang behind them. They turned their heads and looked back. Shockingly, The house was completely collapsing, and while it fell apart, the children were so scared that they thought the mentally challenged boy had been crushed to death under the rubble. One of the guys got scared and asked them to run away from this place quickly or they would be scolded by the adults. And he also thought that the mentally disabled boy deserved to die because he dared to go there to chase them away. But the strange thing happened. The next day the disabled boy was still alive and walking around in the village. Telling the strange story, the children thought that the mentally challenged boy was a weirdo who could not feel pain, so whenever they saw him anywhere, they rushed in and beat him. That night my grandpa stopped by Mr. Wang's house for dinner. During the meal, my grandpa asked Mr. Wang about the boy, the special boy. He wanted to hear about him, and Mr. Wang asked if my grandpa was beaten by that boy. My grandpa was surprised. Why could that boy chase and beat many people in the village? Mr. Wang expressed sadness and recounted that the boy was a poor child. When he was young, he was still cheerful and lively, and he was just a normal boy like any other child. However, when he was 10 years old, he suddenly became strange. All day he was at the head of the village gate, snarling at the forest, no matter how much his parents intervened. The boy appeared angry, glaring as if there was something terrible in the forest. However, there was nothing in front of him. Everything seemed to be normal. But every day this boy came out there and stood and just looked at the forest. He didn't even go home and pretended to be afraid of something. A few years later, the boy's parents also died of illness. The boy became mentally challenged, and then he wandered around begging in the village. After hearing the story about the poor boy, my grandpa bought some food and went looking for him. He discovered the boy was in a big tree, sitting and staring in one direction. "Hey kid, come down here. I brought you some food." Hearing my grandpa's voice, the boy looked down and said that he couldn't go down at the moment. He had to sit there and watch. So my grandpa was curious. He stepped on the wooden boards to climb the tree and asked the boy. My grandpa gave him some food to eat and then asked him what he was watching. What was so interesting? So, the boy said that he was watching out for the scary, bad guys. He wouldn't let them into the village to harm people. Hearing that, my grandpa felt very curious, so he asked the boy what they looked like. The boy said that the fearsome people came from the forest. Some were tall and dark. Some had 3 heads, and every time he saw them, he ran to stop them so he wouldn't let them into the village to harm people. Another had a musty smell and was rotten. You could almost see them, but the villagers couldn't. When my grandpa heard this, he immediately understood that this boy could see ghosts, and it was he who chased the children out of the ruined abandoned house to protect them. My grandpa exclaimed that his abilities were amazing. However, the boy said that he could only stop some people, and some others he couldn't. Because of that, when some ghosts went into the village, there were still terrible accidents that would happen. The boy also sadly said that his parents died early because of these scary people. He unfortunately could not protect them. My grandpa also told the children in the village not to bully the boy anymore, but to love him instead. When he returned to the city, my grandpa did not forget the story of the strange boy. 25 years later, he came back to this village. The boy from the past had become a middle-aged man. He still silently protected this village from evil ghosts, and no one knew if he was crazy or not.